Welcome to the podcast, Alison.
Thank you for having me, Peter. I'm glad to be here.
So it was really fun talking to you in the pre-show. You have a very unique way of approaching the climate crisis, and I would love if you could tell the audience more about that.
Absolutely. So, as I told you earlier, I have really been born into this. People always ask me, well, how did you get into what I call the save the world industry? How'd you get into the save the world industry? And I'll tell them, well, it's not something that I chose. It's something that chose me, and it chose me at a very young age. You say, what do you mean? When I was 3, my dad was a very smart, very bright, working at the Federal Trade Commission. Both of my parents and my grandparents were public servants. So this was the family tradition. And we lived in DC, and had a bunch of progressive ideas. And he also had a lack of sleep because he had a toddler and an infant at home, right? So here's me as a toddler, infant Alison, going up to this harried but well-intentioned man asking, Dad, what happens when we die? And he looks at me, overwhelmed, says, nothing. Dad, what do you mean? Nothing. Nothing happens when we die. Now, for a 3-year-old Allison, this was horrifying. This was terrifying. This idea of nothingness. What does that mean to Allison? Oh my God, how that impacted me from that formative stage was that I became incredibly hyper aware of how wonderful not nothingness is. The wonderness of everything but nothingness, life, existence, the big feelings, big emotions, etc. And this is what formed me from that very young age. Now, another thing that formed me was our religion was camping, right? I grew up in a Unitarian Universalist household, which, for those of you that are unfamiliar, it is considered a Christian denomination. They're Universalist because they believe in universal salvation, that the whole idea of no way but through me is actually not in our faith. And so we're a very tolerant religion. So we're the refugee camp of religions, basically. It's had a lot of folks that have been unwelcome in their own houses of faith for whatever reason. But this is what my background is. This is how I grew up. And so I grew up with this idea that we are all humans and we are all, you know, have the right to pursue happiness, as our forefathers told us, and that we all have a responsibility to take care of our world, our planet, our home, our spirituality, our being human. So that was how I grew up. That was my reality. So when it came to issues of the environment and what I call the save the world industry, it's a very natural, logical step for me that when I got old enough and I got to read college, I went to the same alma mater that Steve Jobs dropped out of. So we had all of these computers in the basement. We're asking these big ideas in this bucolic setting. And my thesis was a history of science. So I had both 2 majors. I had a major in history and a major in biology. And so my thesis was the nature of nature, the history of ecological thought. And what I came up with and what my actual premise was is that we had a schism within humanity's civilization. Basically, it's no less than that over the last 1,000 years in terms of viewing ourselves as being part of nature or viewing ourselves as being apart from it. And those that viewed us as being part of nature became what is known in the 19th century, and this was my wonky academia for the thesis, as vitalists. So the vitalists were ones that believed that life was the essence, life was the driving force, and life should be the organizing principle for human metaphor for how we were going to run our civilization. Well, the mechanists were the ones that thought that no, it's not vitalist, it's not life. Life is actually, our universe is a giant machine, right? Or a giant clock or a giant, engine. And we can manipulate those cogs and levers. And that's how we change our universe. And it's none of this touchy-feely woo vitalist stuff. We're a machine. And that frame of reference, that mechanism has built our civilization over the 20th century. And at the same time, it has led to a pyramid shape of power and hierarchy, right? It leads to top down direction. It leads to a military that can give, a general can give orders, a corporation where a CEO can give orders, local government where the mayor gives orders, right? And it's because in a mechanist society, that is the frame of reference that gets built. What I'm suggesting is that we got it wrong. We've been asking the wrong questions and we've been getting the wrong answers. And the chaos and the corruption and the pollution and the climate crisis and everything that we see in the world right now that is so terribly wrong is actually an outgrowth of that top down thinking. And so, how do we change that? Well, we flip the switch. We are all the ones that are responsible for our own planet. We are all the ones that are responsible for our own spirituality. We're all the ones that are responsible for our own time in this non nothingness. And in doing that, in flipping that, there's no way but through. And that's where I have a different frame of reference. And that's why this long winded way of describing why I got to where I am now in the Save the World industry. But so there are all of these aspects that we have to talk about because really there is no way but through, that we have to get to this radical notion that, if we live on Gaia, which is this huge organism floating in space, and we are organisms in that organism floating in space with all of the balanced systems and ecosystems that reference this Gaia life entity, then our systems have to mimic those life systems. And so where we have machine oriented thinking with regards to how we deploy our economic development strategies, our technology strategies, our financial strategies, we have to shift the switch and think of it much more from a quote vitalist perspective, but not really, because now we have the science. We're designing artificial intelligence. Only it's not human intelligence that we're looking at. We're looking at biological intelligence. We're looking at mycelium, which organizes the forest. Mycelium organizes the forest so that it is in its own entity, its own organism, because it balances resources, it communicates, it allows the trees to communicate with one another. And you look at the forest as actually being its own organism with mycelium organizing it. And we look at artificial intelligence as not human intelligence, but that intelligence of that mycelium and what that means for our own communities. Our communities are now, if we're mimicking that, our communities are organisms too. And what's really interesting is that if we see it in that frame of reference, if we see it from the true way in which nature exists, not the way in which basically robber barons at the turn of the 19th century co-opted Darwinism and said, oh, it's all about competition. And I'm going to recognize competition. I'm going to make all of our infrastructure globally based on the idea that it's about competition. And this economic system that we have, it's competition. And what I was going to give as an anecdote to how this frames asking the right question to get the right answer is that when you ask the question, how can we cooperate? How can we turn our communities into forests? Then you get ecosystem health and you get human health. And the frame of reference that only sees it through a competition actually is the antithesis of that end goal. Anyway, so that's the answer to your first question.
Boy, that there is a lot to unpack there. I want to go
Sorry.
back I want to go back to the beginning because I thought that the question you asked your dad was a good question when you were a little girl. And his response saying, there's nothing. And that putting you off on this path towards life and the focus on trying to see the living as
Right.
opposed to the mechanistic, which is very interesting. Maybe unpack that a little bit and try to apply to real world applications. How does that philosophy inform, let's say, what we do in regards to the climate crisis?
When we talk about regenerative economic development, we often have an idea of, okay, we want our economies to grow. We want them to be reborn and, regenerate, and we want them to have, a regenerative aspect to them. But what does that mean? Right. And so that's where the practical is that, well, what we mean by living economies is just that, is that they mimic And you often hear them referred to often as circular economies. That in these economies, there's zero waste, right? It's 100% energy efficient. In natural economies, we need to mimic that. And how do we do that? Right. My premise is that one way of doing that is looking at how those natural systems regenerate themselves and what we can apply to our economic systems, our technology development systems, our community systems that mimic some of those principles that work in nature. Now, that said, already just from the technology standpoint, we can have circular economies that are just based on trying to figure out mechanisms where 100% of our waste is turned into 100% of our energy, for example. But it's a lot more complicated than that. That's the main goal, right? 100% of our waste is transformed into 100% useful services to humanity, whether it's energy or making a bed or whatever. It's production, food, water availability, et cetera. That everything that we do either has zero footprint because we're working within natural systems. So if we're doing all of that human development and human existence right, we should have a very minimal level of waste, right? If we're designing our systems appropriately. So, and what this looks like in the far future, for example, is we're going to go from centralized systems where we have automobiles that take us from point B in a linear frame of reference to three-dimensional transportation, where we already have electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles that are powered by renewable energy. Those already exist, already being commercialized. That way of transport of goods and services, of people, that is now not two-dimensional, but now three-dimensional. Fast forward many years in the future and have a radically decentralized humanity. And those electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles are now radically micronized so that we have renewable personal air transport. The Jetsons, but not with a jetpack, right? And people say, "Oh, that's crazy," et cetera. But think about it and humanity, even the myths, the Greek myths, Daedalus and Icarus, wanting to fly, angels, flying humans, and the Jetsons, for our modern fairy tales. But and to think that we need to ask the right questions that get us to that kind of living environment on the planet because there is no way but through. We have to change all of these systems. And in a system where our incredible resources and all of what we've built over this adolescence of human civilization, i.e., the last 10,000 years, now that we're evolving, we will be able to leverage what we've created in a machine way of thinking to have the right resources to create and imagine and realize these kinds of what seem now fantastical.
Sounds awesome. And I appreciate you bringing up the circular economy, really exciting technology advancements in that area. I'd love to unpack a little. Where do you see today? Where do you see your philosophy at work, or let's say your way of thinking at work? And where do you see the opposite? Where do you see the most strongly mechanistic type of thought processes? And where do you see the most, I think you called it vitalist processes in play?
The vitalists are actually, I'm going to start with that because really all of the silver buckshot, there's no silver bullet. It's only silver buckshot. And every one of the silver buckshot has an element of being part of that synthesis and synergy and the quilt of each of their quote value propositions, but within this kind of living frame of reference. So whether it's, grass fed cattle and the farmers and the agriculture that are looking at sustainable agriculture principles with regards to how they are treating they are not it's the diversions from industrial farming to regenerative farming. And so in this case, it would be having cattle that are herded through the natural cycles, the way that normal herd animals would eat they're mimicking that now. So they're mimicking what goes on in nature for the cattle are healthier and the environment is healthier. You look at folks that are developing solar. These are folks that are, in a sense, coming up with the way the natural world captures its energy, right? It's a pseudo photosynthesis, right? And they're creating this artificial, what in the natural world is photosynthesis. So regenerative farming, photosynthesis of sunshine solar folks that are looking at community-based economic development, that are looking at community scale energy regulatory mechanisms. That's another element. So you see that there are many ways in which there are already folks embracing this. And I don't want to say vitalist because that's a particular point in time and it has its own narrative. What I'm talking about is that's its progenitor. But where we are now is this idea of biomimicry for human systems. And so in that, if we're looking at ways in which we tie all of these elements together in a creative deployment package. So let's say we had innovation infrastructure in this frame of reference where we're now marrying in a specific geographic location, bundling all of these technology elements with a policy mechanism that supports its continued health with financial innovations that allow decentralization to occur at a more rapid pace. This is where we'll see that convergence and we'll see those synergies. So even Tesla has already been considering just on a micro level bundling their power wall with their vehicles, with their solar installations, so that you have a 3-in-1 living a local economy in your own home. So so there are all sorts of ways in which we are progressing on the technology frame of reference. What I'm suggesting, and it always makes everyone in the room, in my rooms, a little oogie, is that the way in which humans are a part of this equation is not the way we've seen it in that top down model in terms of the base of the pyramid now being the progenitor of our civilization. It's something that does take an incredible heavy lift from a much wider perspective than just the technology. And in a sense, the reason why we've looked at the universe as a giant machine is because it's easier to manipulate. A lot of this that we need to work on is a huge challenge. And yet it's also the bigger the challenge, the bigger the opportunity, as Eisenhower said. And it's the changing of the mindset and the frame of reference that is the harder lift, but it's just as integral as just evolving the technology. So how do we shift the perception of folks towards the more ability to harmonize and be altruistic in our economic and techno development and deployment models? Yeah. I think social media actually has a huge potential there, even though like people like to bash it as being kind of just a cesspool of misinformation these days. And I get that. At the same time, allowing us to communicate one on one in this exponentially accessible way is very important. I think there's something there in terms of how we shift perception. This is actually looking at humans as what we are, as part of this planet, is what we are. We're not just on the planet. We're within this incredibly wonderful, beautiful, terrifying living orb in the nothingness of space. And so knowing that, having that Bill Shatner moment from the spaceship where he finally saw Star Trek was amazing. We're going to all these new worlds, but look at what we have here. And look at all of us as grains of a sand of the beach. This is not the great man theory anymore. This is we each are a grain of sand on that beach. And so one grain of sand doesn't do anything. But if we come up with ways in which we can bulldoze the sand, then we can change the beach.
So within this sort of environment, if I'm an individual and I want to thrive and move forward and succeed, what do you think is the optimal role for people within this sort of new way of thinking about things?
The new way of thinking of things in terms of this bottom the grains of sand, the aggregate intelligence being innovation, being the feedstock for our economic development as opposed to extraction, all of that, you know, for that individual, it comes down to you have a certain amount of time on the planet. You have your own frame of reference, what you feel is important, what you feel is relevant. What do you want to do with your time on the planet? And what do you want to do with it in terms of looking at where you are now? What can you do today? In some ways, being in the save the world industry as long as I have been is kind of like being a first responder. I have incredible, I mean, I'm not comparing myself to the amazing work that those folks do. But the idea that you're dealing with life and death on a daily basis, if you're in the save the world industry, it's just a longer time frame for when those deaths are going to occur. But, it's still a life and death is on your mind every day. And I think that folks that are just now waking up to the climate issue are getting a little taste of what some of us who have been thinking about this stuff for 35 years have been dealing with every day. And so, what I would give as advice to folks that are waking up to this, maybe speaking a little bit to what does the individual do, is again, it's on a day to day basis. What can you do today? Don't get deer in the headlights about the overwhelming potential for what might happen. The biggest word in that sentence is might. Those might because it might happen, might not. It hasn't happened yet. So it's not real yet. But might also in terms of what strength do you have in yourself today to serve making this planet a better place than when you first got here?
Yeah, it's a cool way of thinking of it. So if innovation is the feedstock, maybe a role for individuals who are entrepreneurial slash creative is to actively participate in that innovation. When you talk about circular economy, you talk about regenerative agriculture. I think about electric vehicles. Who are some innovators that you really respect? For me personally, you mentioned Steve Jobs.
I would say he's one of my heroes. Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, that woke us up to what was happening with regards to chemicals and the natural world. She's another hero of mine. One who was not a hero of mine, and if you know my social media, I actually have maintained a Twitter account, X account, whatever, just to bash Elon Musk. I know how terribly adolescent that is, but I am not a Elon Musk fan. You know how I'm talking about the top down versus bottom up? You can see where he does not fit my model. It's just something that makes me very uncomfortable. Not only that, when you look at some of his statements with regards to how he integrates what he thinks is possible, he's looking for an escape hatch. He's building a bunker somewhere here, but his big bunker is Mars. He's taken us for Mars. And so he was asked actually a question by someone, I can't remember, it was a few months ago. I think it was his autobiographer. Walter Isaacson was interviewing him and he asked, so what, you're going to Mars and, we've got this huge threat from the AI development. We've got this singularity that could, wipe out all of human civilization. And, so you're escaping to Mars. Why won't AI, if it's more intelligent than us, just follow us to Mars? Silence. Very good question. No answer. You can be clever, but you don't have to be intelligent. And what terrifies me about Elon Musk is that he's clever, but I worry that he's not too intelligent. I could be wrong.
It's ironic. I won't weigh in on Elon specifically. I like numbers. When it comes to, let's say, any individual that's reduced CO2 more than anybody, it's got to be him because the EVs, I mean, we're seeing Teslas. My stepson just got a Tesla.
Yeah.
Uh, and man, the thing's awesome.
Yeah.
Uh, blows away that I've got a little 3 Series.
But here's the thing. Here's the
Tesla
thing
just
though,
blows it
because
away.
I have a somewhat of a different perspective because you're right. The electric vehicle has been incredibly important.
Electrification, right? It's
And
really
electrification,
important.
and obviously that is a huge element of it. The challenge though is that by having that frame of reference, going back to the mechanistic way of looking at it and having that be that the perception that this is the fix for this problem. Yes, it's reduced that carbon. We need that desperately. But the challenge is that we need an integrated system, not just electrification of transportation. And my frustration with Elon as being someone that has this huge potential to really create integrated systems, why I mentioned the Tesla, integrations for their Powerwall, et cetera, is because the way in which he's now approaching this, and we need, if we're all grains in a sand, think about the power of his sand, right? My frustration is that he's not asking the right questions and he's not going to get the right answers at this point. And my frustration is that while he has numbers don't lie, and I do acknowledge that he's done so much for reducing our carbon footprint with the success of his vehicles, that he's lost opportunities. He's lost myriad opportunities to put money into these more holistic, integrated ways of shifting our economic development. And fundamentally, the biggest challenge I have is that he's the richest man on the planet. And that whole model is broken. So there it is.
Right. So I think that's a good thing to unpack. What about the model is broken that Elon got wealthy for Tesla?
Well, the big challenge in the big picture is that we're not measuring the right things. We're not asking the right questions. So, for example, the hugest thing that I had an aha when I was getting my MBA, and we had a class where we were figuring out LIBOR and who sets the currency exchange rates, and it's all based on the price of crude oil. So basically, extraction and energy really does drive the entire global economy. And when I had that aha moment, I realized that it was energy that we really needed to focus on to make our planet more sustainable, make human civilization on our planet more sustainable. And so when you look at energy and you look at how you shift that, what we're measuring right now is we're treating it like a commodity. We're treating it as the more I sell of these electrons, the more value I create for human society. And that's the wrong freaking question. That is the wrong question. The right question is we need to measure energy, not as a commodity, but as a unit of work. We need to measure it so that it's measured as the service it's giving us to our human civilization. And when we do that and we're measuring as a unit of work to manage, we're going to maximize the amount of energy we make useful to us. And we're going to minimize the amount of energy that is non-useful to us. And that in and of itself, if we just shift that one metric, changes what is incredibly broken right now. And what's broken is we're measuring the wrong things. And so we're watering daisies with fire hoses, right? And we're running out of water for the daisies being watered with the fire hose, right? So it's incredibly backwardly broken. Like sustainability, all sustainability is material and energy and material going into a system and product and non-product coming out. And sustainability just means that you maximize the product and you minimize the non-product for business, obviously. What's so broken right now is that we do not function in any of our economies, in any of our markets, in any of our human activity with that very fundamental driving force as top of mind. We just don't. And because of that, our whole system is completely nonsensical almost. We've done all these very clever things. We are just not intelligent.
Gotcha. So integrating sustainability more into the system is a good thing as far as making it a part of everything that we do.
Right.
Looking at both outputs and input costs, looking at everything.
Right. But part of that is all the cards it's all stacked against us right now because we're not measuring the right things. So what we're told is, so for example, it should be like falling off a log to solarize your house or to integrate any other form of renewables that is more appropriate for your neighborhood. Should be like falling off a log. if our economic systems was measuring the right things. And if we were pricing everything according to measuring the right things and managing the right things. But because we don't have that system, it's a challenge. And we have to put into place these stopgap measures, whether it's a policy mechanism or an innovation or a type of financing package, or the technology itself comes down in price because of economies of scale. We can make it fit, but we don't have time now that we have the climate crisis. So we need to start orchestrating those solutions themselves, not waiting for them to happen overnight happen as a matter of course on their own. Um,
Right.
so
So what I hear you talking about really is kind of the pricing mechanism. So maybe by assigning an appropriate price to carbon, as an example, which they've started to do in various places, we might be able to
the
have the
price for
pricing
carbon,
mechanism.
no, let's call it what it is, because the price says that you're paying for something because it's a beneficial to you. And so, I'm going to pay a price for carbon. No, it's a tax. We're taxing carbon and we're doing it because we don't want carbon. And that's okay. Taxes are one of the ways we have in this current broken system to try to manage what we consider as value and what we consider as value to us. And that changes as humanity. That changes as we evolve our ideas and we evolve our communities and our civilization. And so that's what we have to work with now. And right now, the idea that we've removed any sort of regulatory mechanism into private sector marketplaces as a way to let the silent market dictate what is going to be best for humanity long term, when it's based on a false premise that competition is the driver for nature, when we know that's not true. This is the 1-2 punch that's leading to absolutely global disaster. And it's why we're still on the same pathway that we're on now. So when we look at this, let's call it what it is. It is a tax. And the reason why we're taxing it is because we do not want carbon. And the reason why we don't want carbon is because it's killing our planet. So, it's pretty straightforward on the one hand, and then it's incredibly complex because coming back to our original conversation, the value systems have to change for people to say, oh, it's a non-brainer to pass a carbon tax. And so it's a chicken egg, right? So all of this is incredibly complicated. And yet coming back to, one of the reasons I hang out with the folks that I do when I go to West Virginia to go fishing, they're all on Trump MAGA hat wearers. They're all firmly for what I've identified now as populist traits. The populism has been very strong in this country, but you have populism that's driven by a disparate group of people that come together on a grassroots organization level. And then you have populism whose goals are driven by an authoritarian one person figure. And they're both populist. They're both unrest. They're both people saying the economy is broken, our country is broken, something's wrong, things need to change. But when you do it not from a grassroots organizational way, but from a top down authoritarian way, you get the Third Reich. And so it's important to me to talk to folks that are populists that believe strongly in a lot of what I believe too. I believe the system is broken. I believe everyone needs to have greater access to wealth and health and well-being. I believe in our children and their educations. I believe all of this. What we disagree on is that I think that we should have a grassroots form of change. And those folks think that we should have an authoritarian. And the reason you need to stay engaged with those people is every person that's on the fence that I can bring back to the grassroots part is one less person that is supportive of what we know from history. History, you're doomed to repeat it. You know, you don't learn from it. If we learn from it, we know where this is going, right?
Gotcha.
So
Well, I hear you. So on both sides of the political aisle, there's populism. But you feel that on one side of the political aisle, it's more authoritarian, and on the other side, it's more grassroots in
yeah,
nature.
in
And
nature,
therefore, both sides are, let's say, looking for change, but they're just
right?
going about it in a different way.
And what I would want to see is, you do have moms of liberty and the folks that are book burning and stuff that have a more grassroots approach to their cultural ideas and political values. I'm not saying it doesn't exist on that side of the aisle, but to be honest with you, I think even looking again, it comes to looking at it as bipartisan, as two parties, is also part of the brokenness of the system. because, then it's an either or, both end. Do I want Coke or do I want Pepsi? And I want to go to a store where I can get juice or milk or Coke or Pepsi or anything else that I want to satisfy what I need for my nutrition. So, and that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, we've been going long here.
Sorry.
I guess the only other question I would have is, where do we go from here? How do we break down these, let's say, silos of populism and get people to come together to be able to affect change?
It's the think global, act local. I hate to be so pithy, but for my part, my day in the life is, I spend time engaging in what I consider meaningful ways in which to impact um for my part, I know a whole bunch about all three of those realms. So I try to do what I can in my career. But what I do on a personal level in terms of how we create change is, get involved with online entities that support kind of this shift towards a more decentralized way of living, whether that's decentralization for local circular economic development, decentralization with regards to more importance on local politics and local issues, decentralization with regards to financial entities and what the entire future of finance may look like in terms of going from centralized financing to decentralized financing. And yes, I am tiptoeing around the dirty words. Distributed ledger technology, DLT. I'll use that one because nobody actually knows what it is. You can Google it and then you can see what I'm talking about. So these are things that on a daily basis, again, if you are of one political persuasion, start talking to people in your community of the other political persuasion, and vice versa. Try to hear each other's perspectives. Go fishing with your neighbor who has a sign out on their front that you don't agree with. That's hard for people, especially in this era of isolation and social media, and we're just on our phones. But, that's again, I'm coming back to the biomimicry. There's no comparison for a warm hug and a smile face to face. I know it sounds cheesy and Hallmark, but you don't get that from an emoji. An emoji is just a smiley face on your screen. A real smile from a real person, it makes you feel eminently better than that little emoji. So, anyway,
I think you hit an interesting topic, and I'd like to unpack just a little bit more before we jumps. Decentralization, I think, is pretty incredible, right? And I think it's played an incredible role in the energy transition
mm,
already. We're looking aggressively at wind, solar, battery storage, other types of smaller facilities to generate energy. We're looking at
right,
data centers in a more modular fashion, which is decentralized. So we're
right.
seeing in a huge way. And I think that trend has already started to pervade the economy. The
Yeah.
question is, will that trend, and is it a good thing if it pervades government systems? So we have less of a centralized government authority and
It's
more of a
both ends. The only reason
decentralized.
we need the centralized authority really at the end of the day is for war. We need to have a strong military because we're living in this dog eat dog, survival of the fittest warfare everywhere world. And when you start decentralizing, you lose a coffer that can fund a global army, a global military. And I get that, which is why when I'm talking about all this stuff, I realize how incredibly nebulous and complex and overwhelming it is in terms of the size and scale of the challenge. But, you're right. Right now, that decentralization happening in a vacuum without us addressing all of our other needs for mitigating the need for having a military is a really stupid idea, which is why we need to do that as well. And the larger scale stuff, that's the challenge, and that's what you're asking me, and I don't have an answer for that yet. I'm someone that has an arc of a career that's 30 years trying to ask the right question to get the right answer, and so that's one of the ones I'm working on now,
These are
you
big
know?
tough questions,
So, yeah.
right? So
Yeah, yeah,
I
exactly.
think about Athens, and the rise of the city state where systems were much
Right,
less centralized, more decentralized, and
right.
the power was really at the city level as opposed to at the federal government level, overseeing these massive empires.
But see, this is where we need to look, and this is where I am the opposite of an isolationist, right? I mean, I'm the opposite of a lot of the political challenges we have with right wing philosophies. And I seem like I'm completely just progressive, left wing, kumbaya, but I'm really not. I'm looking at this as a being scientifically basis. Again, Arthur C. Clarke, magic is technology we don't understand yet. Like, I'm looking at this in terms of where is the science? And the science tells us that Darwin did not say it's survival of the fittest. The science tells us that it's cooperation. So right now we're focused globally on a broken power system because it's based on the wrong natural metaphor. And so cooperative entities like the United Nations, are a good, in my opinion, we need more robust global entities that somehow speak directly to organizing those grains of sand and not the top of the pyramids. And that's the challenge because,
Sure. If you
yeah,
have larger global entities that have power that may be unelected, ultimately there are people in charge, and
yeah,
you have to wonder who makes the decisions.
right. Well, again, back to and again, it's within a nefarious frame of reference, but the gaming the revolution, those individual nodes, those individual day traders influencing institutions by an aggregate hive mind, you know, there's something potentially there for not this nefarious applications, but for ones that are much more altruistic and beneficial. And so, even crowdsourcing is one nascent example of that, and crowdfunding and Kickstarter, version 4.0 of that potentially, that organizes the grains of sands in a way for shifting mentalities and shifting where resources are allocated for these transformative regenerative economic development strategies may be one way of looking at that. So,
Sure, yeah, and that's why I love the decentralized power model so much, is
yeah,
because ultimately centralization is working in energy, because if any one system that's decentralized, if you have any one, let's say, solar farm go offline, it isn't too big of a problem. Whereas if you
right.
have one massive centralized coal plant go offline, it's a big problem in
Yeah,
the
exactly.
the
Exactly.
old industrial way. So I think the
No,
translation
the
in solar.
resilience is absolutely there. And there are a lot, and that's where it's at both ends. There are lots, and I'm sure I cut you off, but there's a lot of different ways where the benefits already fit into the current lexicon of what's considered to be beneficial, right? These ancillary benefits that are now augmenting that are ones I think that need to be broadcast more. So, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And so where I was going was, is as you see that power as a metaphor for decentralized power plants, I think it makes a lot of sense as we look at government systems. If you have power concentrated in any one person's hands within the government or within any one entity's hands, then if there's a problem in that system, it has the potential to do massive damage. Whereas if you have decentralized power and authority, if any one person, let's say, goes off the reservation, there's less likelihood that it impacts everybody.
Yeah. And furthermore, it just from the perspective, how would we actually realize minimizing waste in our systems? How do we realize maximizing what we're pulling and extracting and its utility for us? The way that we do that is by having as many point of use applications as possible, because just the whole transportation of these entities in and of itself creates inefficiencies, right? So a localized economic development model that is trying to make energy and resources and what we need for human civilization on that micro level more expedient. It also addresses climate change in a very potentially impactful way, because
Absolutely.
transportation emissions are what are causing so much of the carbon issue that we have. So,
Good stuff. Well, Allison, this has been great having you on. I'll leave with the theme of the day, I think, is decentralization, but we just had a lot of good conversation around, big issues, big topics that can't be solved in one podcast. But Allison,
we did our best though, right?
we tried our best. It's
I
been
see.
great
Next
having
time we'll
you.
have a beer,
Yeah.
and
It makes it a little easier. You don't know. I mean, if we went all off into space sober, you never know where we that.
This is true. This is true. Well, Peter, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you,
I
Allison.
really had a great time.
And check out Allison Wise on LinkedIn.